the idea of today is to look at, we all have problems with propagating some species, and we all have problems with propagating some species in some years at some times. So one year we'll get a whole lot to come up, we think, yeah, we've got it, we've solved the problem, and then the next year none come up, and you think, so this is really a chance to share ideas and get questions answered. So to start off, we've got Daniel, who works at Maroondah Council, and he's an expert in all things rare and threatened and genetic, and he's just a man who knows everything. So I'll leave it to him. Thanks, Daniel.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. I don't know everything. I'm not
That's
here
not what you told me.
I think the most important thing as a nursery person you can do is admit that you don't know everything and find out, clearly define what it is you don't know, and then you can work on it. A lot of what I do is actually out in the field. And today, I'll break up into two parts what I'm going to talk to you about. Firstly, I'll focus on mostly the kind of what I think is a big problem that's coming up facing nurseries and also bushland regeneration is the genetic issues facing our nurseries and our plants in the wild. And then the second, I'll focus a bit more on production issues and with a bit more of a focus on seed. So we might get to some of that in this first bit, but it might have to be during the seed session a bit later on. So that's what I've just said. Maroondah's bushlands have been, we've got over 40 bush reserves or remnant areas in Maroondah, and they've been actively managed for conservation for over 25 years now. The weed content, the exotic weed content is really low because we've had this professional team in there that really know their stuff. But our diversity is still going backwards. So despite these awesome reserves with hardly any weeds, the number of species and the number of plants within those species is kind of on a downward trajectory. And so our weeds are being replaced, our exotic weeds are being replaced by indigenous weeds a lot of the time. So this is an area in one of our reserves. It was fenced off for rabbits at one stage because it was so good, so diverse, but now it's just got microlina. And nothing much else. So that's one of the problems that we're facing. So traditional bushland regeneration techniques just aren't cutting the mustard anymore. That's what I suppose where I'm going. And the main reason for that, we're going to lose a few bits because they'll be cut off, but we'll see how we go. The main reason is a loss of regenerative processes in a lot of our bushland reserves. So processes which turn over the seed growing cycle. So a lot of our species in bush reserves aren't producing progeny anymore, aren't producing seedlings, and therefore they're kind of stalled evolutionarily. You need ongoing turnover of a species and a population in order to maintain a healthy, dynamic, evolving system. So there are several processes which are missing. So fire, you'd all be aware we have less fires, and they're usually during autumn, so they're not kind of what our bush is used to. Bush is used to hot fires during summer, not cool fires during autumn. But even when you do get them, they're often, we have maybe one fire a year, and we've got 40 reserves, so that's a rotation cycle of over 40 years, which is not enough for a lot of our species. A lot of plants for rare and sodden soils, so things like Stylidium dyspectum or a lot of the Pattersonias and things like that. They're evolved for those wet soils. We've drained a lot of those in Maroondah, and over the last 20 years, the ones that we have left have sort of dried because of drying conditions, and so you're not getting that flood rejuvenation event. And then there's animal interactions like pollination or digestion. There's some Persunias out there which would have been eaten by emus and things like that in the past and pooed out, and that would sort of stimulate the recruitment of those species, but that's no longer happening. You don't have the little bandicoots and things digging in your reserves, slowly turning over what's in the soil seed bank. So there's just a kind of a lot of our species have stopped reproducing. And this is one of the reasons why. Our bush is basically, and this will be the same for most of y'all's bushlands, fragmented, really fragmented. In the past it would have been one big continuous forest where pollen and seed would gradually move from one side to the other and from over here into Maroondah and so forth. Now we've just got the isolated patches, and diversity is really stuck within those. So when you do fragmentation like that, when you make lots of small reserves from one big one, you inevitably lose species. And one of the reasons why, if you consider this whole area before it was cut up and fragmented, you might have a species that only exists in a special environment in this bit. If you only retain these and you don't retain the special environment, then you instantly lose that species. But even in these other fragments that you do retain, you can never support as many species in a smaller area as you can with a bigger, more complex area. So this here will support more species than this will over time, and again than this, and then this. So the smaller, the less species, and the quicker you reproduce, the quicker you will go extinct. So short-lived species will tend to be lost quite quickly from fragmented reserves, but you can have trees that last hundreds of years after a reserve's been fragmented, but eventually they don't have the kind of population rejuvenation mechanisms to continue, and you'll lose even those trees after potentially hundreds of years. So that's called the extinction debt, and we'll all be having those in our reserves, or that in our reserves. So another problem with small populations is that they're easily lost through just random disaster. This here is Dianella amina. It's one of three plants that we've got which are actually natural plants in Maroondah. And just next door to it here, some soil's been dug out for a mountain bike track. So that thing came within, that far of being lost, a third of our diversity in Maroondah, just because it's a small population. If we had 100 of them in the reserve, we're always going to have a bit of a backup. But when you've only got 3, then you're much more prone to those kind of catastrophic losses, they're called. Small populations, it's a problem. It's really important to get a handle on the genetic side of what we're doing in order to tackle some of these problems that we're having. So natural selection, which is what sort of evolution works on, positive evolution works on. In every population there's going to be variation, which means just things are different genetically. So we all look different. We've got a lot of genetic variation. Natural selection works by removing genes or sort of features which are not adaptive. So here the predatory bird can see the white mice better than it can see these ones, and so there's a selection pressure on the white mice. The grey mice leave more of them survive. They get to have more progeny, and over time there'll be more grey mice in the population. So favourable mutations are more likely to survive and reproduce. That's how it's supposed to work. But unfortunately, with small populations, various things get in the way, and your positive selection, so your selection for good genes, isn't always possible. It doesn't work. So you've probably heard that there used to be an idea that if you had 50 individuals in a population, it was probably okay in the long run from inbreeding and those sorts of problems. But they've recently increased that to 500 now to survive in the really long term. So if you can think of your reserves that have less than 500 of a species in them, that's probably every single reserve for most species. So if they're totally isolated, you can see why that might be a problem. Anyway, so there are complex reasons why, for genetic reasons, why small populations are problematic. I really think that should be a topic in itself that we could talk about one day maybe, if you'll let me. But just to quickly go through it, there's things like inbreeding, which is you've probably all heard of. It means that genetic problems in your population are brought to the forefront, and your population loses fitness and doesn't reproduce as well, and so over time it gets smaller and smaller. And the more, so I suppose when you've got a small population, it means that you're more likely to have relatives in that population, especially if you're a plant who sort of breeds, often with themselves or with close relatives. So the smaller the population, the more likely you are to be inbreeding, and then that's a problem. Genetic drift is a problem that what happens is with all populations randomly lose genetics, but when you've got a small population, genetic drift works more strongly than with large populations, and genetic drift loses genetic features which can be adaptive. So, for instance, in the slide before, the grey mice, you could have the gene that promotes for grey mice lost from the population. Even though it's positive, it can be lost because of genetic drift if you've got a small population. So it's an insidious kind of way of losing diversity. Alley effects are effects where if you've got 1,000 little daisies in a reserve sitting there, the pollinators will find them. Whereas if you've only got 2 or 3, the pollinators might not be able to find those. So alley effects are where you've got more of a species, you just get benefits from it. Whereas if you've got less, you get you don't get those benefits. And finally, another problem with small populations is breeding systems. So if you've got a population that's mostly related to each other, sometimes plants develop techniques to prevent inbreeding, which is a sensible thing to do. But if all you've got to breed with are relatives, that means that you've got no one to breed with. So we have several of these problems going on in Maroondah. We've got an inbred Kilsyth South spider orchid there, so that's one of the rarest plants in the world. There's probably only 4 or 5 of those left in the wild. And that one there produces beautiful foliage and stuff, but never produces a viable flower. So it doesn't contribute to pollination or to seed. And so that's a major problem when you've only got 5 of a species left.
Can I just interrupt you?
Yeah.
Is that a key indicator? No, failure to flower or small flowers?
It could be anything, but failure to flower is definitely a worry.
Yep.
That's a pretty significant concern. It could be something really small, like the leaves just don't get as big or something. Mm-hmm. So there are heaps of different ways inbreeding can show through, but that's definitely, if you're getting that happening, it's a worry. So breeding systems, so the plant on the right is a Xerochryzum palustre swamp everlasting. We only had a clone of this in Maroondah for up to 20 years, and it has a thing where it won't breed with itself or close relatives, so it's got a breeding system that prevents that. Ordinarily it means that this won't be inbred, but if you've got nothing to breed with, we haven't had seed for over 20 years. So we've recently got new stock of this from a different area, and it's genetically diverse, and it's actually producing seed again now, so that's kind of a sort of happy story. It is a happy story. Okay, so I've said with our landscapes now, there used to be one continuous big population of most plants, and now there's all these small isolated populations. Genes are basically restricted to within reserves, so gene flow, which was happening across the whole of Melbourne, is now restricted to within these little reserves. And gene flow is another one of these. It's probably the most important, or one of the most important processes which are now missing. And so our goals in Maroondah are to basically restore gene flow, enlarge small populations to avoid the problems that I've just mentioned, and to increase seed reproduction. So seed reproduction is where you're going to get your potential for evolution. So it produces adaptive capacity. So Each seed is going to be unique compared to if you make a clone of something, it's going to be identical, whereas any seed is going to be somewhat genetically different from its parent. So we're trying to focus on seed production wherever possible. To increase small population size, we are planting or direct seeding or trying to promote natural regen in the wild. And so again, we're trying to mix as many populations together as we can, and that makes, instead of lots of small populations, it's effectively one large population. So you're reducing those problems that I mentioned earlier. This is our Pattersonia fragilis. We've got 2 populations of these, and one is on the downward trajectory. Its habitat is drying out there, and there's nothing we can do about it. So we've grown this one in the nursery of both populations. We're now mixing those, so plants from one are going to the other site, and we're making new sites for them as well to guard against that catastrophic loss of a population that might happen. So we're trying to ensure against loss as well as increasing population size, and we'll be trying to get genetics off you guys as well so that we can add those to our population. How am I going for time?
Okay. 16 and a half minutes.
Okay. We're doing active gene flow. We're encouraging gene flow, so mixing seed or pollen or plants from different areas, trying to produce that one big population, not lots of small ones. So this was a Caladinia that I had in one of our reserves. There's only one of these plants in this reserve, but here we're bringing in pollen from a larger population and swapping it. It means that not only will the plant flower, but it will hopefully produce diverse seed, so that there'll be some chance of it evolving into the future. So yeah, increasing gene flow reduces those small population problems.
Daniel, how far would you go?
We'd go pretty far. I'll get to that in a minute, but
Yep.
what we will do mostly is you'll have as much variation from the local populations as possible, so including your own, but also from your populations, because they'll be the most similar. But as I'll mention a bit later on, we'll go pretty far. So we're also trying where possible to increase seed turnover. As I said, seeds are all unique, and the more that are turning over, some will benefit, some will be better at coping with the environment than others, and hopefully they'll reproduce and make seed, and that means that we can use those to sort of drive evolution in our reserves. So we're actively going out and direct seeding now as well into some of our sites. So this is one of our little seed plots. It was 100% mycophyllina. Now we've put peas back, some acacias, some different grasses, and some lilies, and it's a little bit of a good news story for us. In the west they do a lot of work with direct seeding, but not so much out east. So we're kind of like figuring it out as we go, how to get success with this stuff, but we're getting there.
Did you spray that mycophyllina?
Yeah. It's tenacious, like you have to spray it several times.
And then you just sprinkle the seeds in amongst it, even the pea species?
The peas we sort of scarify in with a like a rake with nails in it. Yeah. So you scarify you put them down and scuff up the soil, and then you say your little things on top. But we may be looking at more like putting little holes and putting an actual seed in there, because the peas aren't responding terrifically. But we're still learning there on that one. We're doing a lot of work with seed farming, and this isn't the same as your stock plants where you've got one or two plants that you use year after year to produce cuttings from. It's you go out and you get as much diversity as possible into as fewer plants as possible, and you grow those in ideal conditions, lots of food, lots of water, and they produce lots of seed. So up to at least hundreds, if not thousands of times more seed than they do in the bush. And they also, they're right there in the nursery, so it's really easy to collect and quick. And so they've got a lot of benefits, these farmed seeds. Really efficient to collect. You're not taking seed from the bush. You can swap it amongst whoever. And we're trying to get our volunteers to actually grow them for us. So we're hoping that we can, at least with simple species, give them out to people who want to contribute to conservation, and they bring it back after collecting the seed from it. Because we've only got a tiny little nursery, so we can't do everything. But this is where we want to go in the long term. This is at Euroa Arboretum. Anyone who's tried to collect herbaceous seed from the wild knows that that's not a lot of fun, and you're not going to get very much. Whereas a method like this means that, because the trouble with herbaceous is they all ripen at a different rate, and they're really hard to see when they're ripe, and it's just a pain in the bum. Here, they'll ripen, they'll drop onto the mat, and they collect it in these little sort of spooky areas, and you just go through and collect them later on. And it'll mean that, because at the moment we're just not able to do enough with our herbaceous, we can't produce enough seed to actually farm them properly, but these guys have nailed it. And if you think about peas, that would also work really well for peas, and probably lots of other species. So seed production areas are a real something to think about, and maybe something that we could all go in with, have a communal one or something. We're doing a lot of stuff on trying to imitate natural processes out in the bush. So this process is where we go out in the dead of summer, the most hottest, horriblest time, where plants are used to, like they're in a state where they're ready for burning. So and they'll tolerate burning. So you can actually, because of that, go through and brush cut them really hard and remove the spoil, the stuff that you've cut up, and that exposes the soil to summer sun baking down on it, and it also promotes the tiny little things like daisies and grasses and whatever that can't germinate when you've got this much thatch on top. But if you've got no thatch and just soil, they germinate really well. So we've had quite a bit of success with this technique, and it's something that we're going to keep doing into the future. It also promotes flowering of lots of species, so species like grass trees, like even Illyria, Mersinoides, works really well to produce seed of that, and Lamandras, various other things as well. That's a splash plot. So this is where we get to going a lot further. The CSIRO predicts that, or modelling from the CSIRO done in 2014 predicts that from the 1990, the number of species in 1990 of plants, in 2050, about half of those will be extinct in areas like Maroondah. So that's an absolute disaster, and it's similar for animals as well. But even if that was just a quarter right, that's a major thing that we have to worry about. And so the only thing we can really do to stop this coming freight train is help our plants to adapt. So they have to change genetically to be able to cope with this thing that's coming. And one of the ways we're trying to think about this is by use of climate analogues. So there are these places in Australia which are predicted to have climates similar to what our, in Melbourne, future climate is likely to be. It's all speculation. None of this is guaranteed, because no one really knows what's going to happen, but we do know that there's a freight train coming, and So you've got to kind of do something. Doing nothing is doing something. Anyway, so these are some climate analogues for Melbourne for 2050. Places like Wangaratta, Wagga Wagga, Cowra. And so they're hotter and drier, basically, than Melbourne. And the idea is that these plants will have genes that may help our local plants survive if we can incorporate them into our local gene pools, because they're already tolerating this environment that we're supposed to be getting. Bringing them in will potentially help. You have to get them to cross with the local population, so there's no point just bringing them in and having them sit there doing nothing. You have to bring them in, have them crossbreed, and then the progeny of those there'll be a mixture of the local plants and these other ones, and they'll have a mixture of the genes, and those will be selected by the environment, so you'll get natural selection on those. So essentially what we're trying to do is breed our plants for climate survival. It's like, if you can breed a schnauzer, you can probably breed an arthropodium that'll tolerate climate change, maybe. So that's the kind of the struggle that we've got coming. I reckon I'll stop there and just do, if there's any questions about the kind of genetic stuff, we can, or I can just keep going straight over into the sort of more seed production based things.
You're talking about the Aroa experiment with shade cropping and
Yep.
seeds. Is that, if we're talking about in the suburban area, I presume we'll be talking more like the model that the Botanic Gardens are using at Cranbourne with the smaller plots.
Possibly, yeah. I'd be happy with just about anything.
Yeah.
But you could do it fairly small. Like if you just had this area here, you could do a herbaceous species. Or you could do pretty well with that, and I'd be fairly happy with that. But it really does, if you're talking about large numbers of plants, which we need to be producing really, like the more numbers we can produce, the more we can get and sort of out there in the bush, the more they can be selected and actually evolve and adapt to the local environment. So I'd be hoping for something bigger than that, but you can have a seed farm literally with a one tray of 50 Physanotus. Like, you can produce heaps. Oh, sorry, yeah, that. Whoops. Yeah. Any other questions? Am I going too fast, too hard?
When we actually sow a seed tray
Yep.
to promote genetic diversity, when we go out to all the different bushland reserves and collect seed, should we just put it all in a big bucket and then just throw them all into a seed tray, because then you're going to get genetic diversity?
Well, that's sort of what we do. You probably want to look at which are your most healthiest populations. So your biggest populations, you have most of that in there, because they'll be retaining the most diversity. But you put some of everything in there. Like ideally, it'd be sort of some proportion of the total number of plants. So if you've got 50 plants and 10 from this reserve and 40 from that reserve, it's a 5 to 1 or whatever it is.
Can I put something
So
there?
mixed
Sorry.
seed trays. Mixed seed trays
Yeah.
is the way to go.
I don't. Unless you've got a particular population that you're trying to sort of grow from, which we do often. But for your just general nursery production stuff, yeah, more diversity is good.
Could I say something about that? What type of species are you looking at to do that with? What type of species? Because we do it with Dilwinias, been doing it for years. Getting Dilwinias from different populations, because they're the ones, there'll be 5 in this one, 6 in this one. Getting them all together, have them as your separate populations, all cross-pollinated, collecting off the separate populations, so you've got a bit more diversity there, and slowly building up the diversity rather than just trying to do it all at once. And then you want to bring something in, like Daniel's doing from somewhere else, and adding that later on.
We haven't really got there for that.
But for little places like that, I used to do Winia because we're here for Knox for years. There'd be a couple in this reserve, and every reserve would have 3 or 4 plants, and the 3 or 4 plants are usually the same family. They're
Gonfalobium. Like
Yeah,
any of these
something.
things, you know, like that's something that we should all be, you know, any genes that we've got, we should be trying to mix them. Anyway, just yell out if you've got other questions. We'll go on to how much time have I got?
4 3/4 minutes.
Give you 5.
We'll start anyway. So the other thing I'll talk about is just general production with a focus on seed. This has been brought to my attention recently again. Don't save on potting mix. You're not going to save any money. Get something good. It doesn't matter if it's not the most expensive. This is something you can talk to each other about, and I'd encourage you to. Oh, we've got a really great mix, or we've got a dud mix. At Candlebark, when I was working there, we had a huge contract that we got, and this was essentially going to, rejuvenate the place pretty much. But just at the start of that, we got this dud mix that just wouldn't grow anything, and it almost killed the place. This is exactly the same stock as this. This was sown before this. Dodgy mix, good mix. The same stuff, we get chlorotic peas, we get, even your most simplest species would just die.
That's a term I haven't heard before.
Chlorotic? Okay, so yellowy, like your iron deficiency.
So that's iron deficiency.
Could be a lot of different things. Nitrogen deficiency, and you don't know. When you buy a mix, I think it's like you should be buying something that you don't have to worry about ever again. You're not, like, the last thing you want to be doing is buying a headache, so don't do it. We use the same stuff that Botanic Gardens uses. I'm lucky I don't have to scratch for pennies, but I just don't think, like, if you're in a situation where you're growing your best stuff and you just can't get it to come up, a good mix will it's just peace of mind. Just spend the money.